We continue with our discussion on working capital, and the next topic that comes to our mind as we had ended in the last section is what is a good level of working capital? Should that be negative? Should that be positive? Or should that be zero? Right? So, what is it that companies would strive to have working capital as? And that's going to be our data point of discussion in this particular section. So let's identify the tenets around negative versus positive working capital. Now, let's for a moment continue with our assumption that we are not keeping cash into our discussion. So we put cash aside somewhere here and just bucket it and put it outside of our discussion, right? So working capital in terms of definition is going to be non-cash current assets minus current liabilities. We will discuss at a later point of time as to why are we really looking at non-cash numbers. But for time being, just stay with me and assume that working capital is calculated as this formula, which is called non-cash current assets minus current liabilities. Now, let's assume we are running a business, right? So we are all running a business and we're all given a few choices, right? So what are these choices? And let's assume that the choices we take have no impact on business for the time being, right? So whether we choose one or the other, my business will remain the same in the context of our discussion, right? Question one, when do we want our clients to pay? So that's the first point. When do we want customers to pay, right? Question two that comes to our mind, how much inventory is good? Is good. And question three that comes to our mind is when do we make payments to suppliers, right? So three questions and let's take them one by one. So when do we want our customers to pay? Do we want the customers to pay now or do we want them to pay later? Now, if we are running a business, then logically, the earlier the money that we receive, the better it is. So almost all of us would want to choose now. There is no point in us telling the customer to pay later because money in our hands today is better than money in our hands 6 months down the line or 1 year down the line. That's basic tenets of time value of money, right? So we would want customers to pay right now. How much inventory is good? So the question's answers would be, do we want low or do we want high? Now, as we go along, there are nuances to each of these questions, and we will discuss those nuances as well. But how much inventory is good? So there are two options a business has. One, you keep the inventory at your end and you make all your supplies based on that. If someone else is keeping the inventory for you, let's say your supplier is willing to keep the inventory for you in the next room. So remember, there is no impact on the business. So whether I keep inventory or someone else keeps inventory, there is no impact on my business of this decision. That's the assumption we started with, right? So if we say that there is going to be no impact on the business of this decision, then why would I want to take any storage cost? If I keep inventory, there are issues around storage. There are issues around recency. What do we mean by recency? Let's say I keep a computer and 6 months down the line, I try to sell it. By then the technology changes. No one wants this computer, right? So how much inventory is good? Most of us would typically say low inventory is good. We want a smaller amount of inventory because that's manageable. Our storage costs are low, and we don't necessarily go and have an impact of a recency effect or obsolescence effect. The inventory does not become obsolete. If I keep cars in inventory, I have to also spend on keeping the cars in the same shape and color. all the while, right? There's an expense that comes in terms of upkeep of inventory itself. So ideally, I want low inventory. And then when should we make payments to our suppliers? Should that be now or should that be later? If I pay it now, the money is gone. If I pay it later, and assuming that does not impact my business, then I first earn interest on that money and then I make the payment. So logically, given a choice, we should try and delay the payments a little bit at least to all our suppliers. So what have we come to? We are saying we want customers to pay right now. We want inventory to be low and we want to make payments later, right? Let's summarize all of this. So if we want customers to pay right now, what is it that we are saying about receivables? We want zero receivables. If we want low inventory, and if possible, assuming it does not impact things, we probably want zero inventory, right? And we want to make payment to our suppliers at a later date. So we want high payables. Put whatever number you want to the payables bit, right? Which basically means we are saying that my non-cash current assets, I want them to be zero, and my current liabilities, I want them to be high. By definition, if I do CA minus CL on this, that would turn out to be negative, right? So if we are running a business, which is what we are doing, if we are running this business, we have inherently arrived at a point where we want working capital to be negative, correct? Now let's summarize this entire discussion once again. We are saying that there's no cash involved in the discussion, so we keep cash outside of the equation. We are running a business, right? Well, the choices we make have no impact on the business that we are running. There are three questions we have to answer. When do we want our customers to pay? Earlier the better. So we want the customers to pay now. That logically means we want receivables to be zero. How much inventory is good? There are issues with storage of inventory and recency effect of inventory. So we want low inventory, basically saying that if it is possible to have zero inventory, we would have zero inventory as well. When do we make payments to suppliers? The later we make the payment, the more the money is available with us. So making of payments has to be later, which means we want payables to be high, at least higher than zero, correct? Which basically brings us to a scenario where current assets are zero and current liabilities are a non-negative high number, which basically gives me CA minus CL as negative, or in other words, working capital becomes negative, right? Now, this is, remember, in contrast to our discussion when we were saying current ratio is actually CA by CL, and that textbooks at least talk about saying that that should be high, right? Now, in our discussion, we actually don't want any current assets. So we are saying that current ratio should be zero or low. That's what this definition would tell us, right? In our case, current ratio is going to be either zero or low. So what is the difference now? How do we arrive at this difference, and who talks about, how do we really justify what is the correct number? Because textbooks typically talk about this, right? Now we'll answer this in a moment, but prima facie, it appears that negative working capital makes sense for a business. If we are running a business and the working capital is negative, we are basically using someone else's money to run the business, right? We take supplies from the supplier, we make something there, and then we sell it to the customer, and the customer pays upfront, right? That is what the premise of negative working capital is. So let's reiterate. Now think about it. Think about a company like Amazon or Dell or Flipkart. What do? You place the order. Assume this is not on cash on delivery. You make the payment. They get the payment, right? So from their perspective, they get payment and then deliver the goods. They don't need to keep too much inventory. So basically you put the money in their hands and then they start kind of working with that money and running the business. In this entire process, where did they need their money into the equation? They did not need it anywhere, right? So you're running the business in a negative working capital scenario on someone else's money, which is not so bad as a scenario, right? Now we do remember the discussion which said CA by CL, which is current ratio. Textbooks say that this should be greater than 1. Should be, right? Should be, because we should have enough current assets to be able to pay our current liabilities. But we just tried and analyzed on working capital. We would want working capital to be negative, which would mean that CA has to be less than CL, which will mean that current ratio will actually be less than 1, right? Now, which one of this is correct? To understand this, you have to realize who's looking at this data. So if you are a bank who's giving a short-term loan, you want to find out how is the company going to pay your short-term loan. There this becomes important, right? But if you are an owner of the company, then you would want to have this scenario. So perspectives become important. We will have a detailed discussion on whose perspective we are looking the data from, but technically, given a choice, you would want to have negative working capital because you're running the business on someone else's money, right? Now, which are the companies that have negative working capital in India, right? So we saw Amazon, Flipkart, etc. Companies like Hero Motocorp, companies like Maruti, Idea Cellular, all telecom companies for that matter, PVR Cinemas, right? These are all companies that have negative working capital, right? Now, what are the primary requirements for a company to be able to have negative working capital, right? So there are two broad requirements that should happen. You want receivables to be low, right? So low receivables, and you want payables to be higher than inventory. Then the equation settles itself, right? We said in current assets and current liabilities, if you have receivables and payables established in such a fashion that receivables are low and payables are higher than inventory, then you will be able to satisfy the equation where we arrive at the definition of current assets being less than current liabilities. Look at the companies: Hero, Maruti, Idea Cellular, PVR, Amazon, Flipkart. There is a common theme in all these companies. What is the common theme in all these companies? These are all companies that are B2C. What does B2C mean? You sell to individuals. If you sell to individuals, you will not have a huge bargaining power of customers because individuals can't bargain. You can't get the bike without making the payment. You can't watch a movie without making a payment, right? So the concept of receivables is not available in these industries. So if the customers don't have a bargaining power, that gets sufficed by B2C typically. And the second thing you will see that these are all companies with dominant market share, right, in their industries. If they have dominant market shares, the suppliers listen to them. The suppliers agree to the terms that have been set. So these are all big companies, right, where suppliers have less bargaining power in the equation. So essentially, if you have a B2C company and you have a big company, then logically the company's working capital could turn negative. There are some other cases where it turns negative. So for example, in telecom, there is no inventory. There are some other businesses like cement. You can't store cement. Cement can be stored. So anything that has perishable output will have no or less inventory. So cement has very less inventories because by definition you are not going to use cement that is more than 3 to 4 months old. You use cement that is recently manufactured, right? So to have a negative working capital, a company needs to have customers who will agree to pay upfront, which is why it needs to be mostly a B2C company, unless you're a very large company and your customers, even though they are B2B, are smaller when compared to you, or which could be a case with a company like Intel, right? So if you look at a company like Intel, they can ask all the computer manufacturers to pay upfront because they're the only guys who are there. There isn't anyone else in the equation. So essentially speaking, if you're very large, that's a different issue. But otherwise, B2C companies have a better chance of having less receivables, and by that definition, have a better chance of having negative working capital. That's one of the conditions. And big companies can discuss this with their suppliers and say that I don't want to pay right now, and take that discussion in terms of creating a negative working capital. So that's where negative working capital becomes important, right? Having said that, if you're a small company and you're a B2B company, it is fairly possible that you will not have a negative working capital. For example, even if you look at a company like Infosys, Infosys has positive working capital. Why? Because there is no inventory, but there is no payable as well. There is no supplier. Most of the suppliers are basically guys who are working for the company and you have to pay them salary, right? But there are going to be receivables, and receivables are there because that's a B2B business. So in some businesses, you will have working capital. In some businesses, you will have a chance of having negative working capital. Given a choice and given a chance, you would want a negative working capital, but that is not the entire story. What happens if you are in a business like Infosys, right? What happens if we are in our computer business, where I was having a working capital requirement of 10,000, right? Now let's say I were to take an order of 5 computers tomorrow and on the same conditions. How much working capital do I need? How much cash do I need in my bank account? Remember, for one computer, I needed 10,000 in my bank account. That came from 30,000 minus 20,000 in our earlier discussion. So for 5 computers, I should need 50,000. That's my broad assumption, right? What happens if, however, my suppliers do not agree to extend the period? What I'm saying is I have sales of 1.5 lakh. That's 30,000 into 5. And I'm telling my suppliers that I'm going to pay you 1 lakh. That's 20,000 into 5 after the same period when I get my sales. What happens if they don't extend the period? If they don't extend the period, this number here changes. If the number is 50,000, I can plan. If the number changes, if working capital changes, the plan goes for a toss. There is no plan. I can't plan for it, right? I don't know how much cash I need to say. So if you think about it, one computer, 10,000, 5 computers, 50,000, which is what I'm saying is working capital should move proportionally to sales. If sales is 100, and receivables are 30, sales going to 200, it's expected that receivables will go to 60. Right? That's logical because you're selling more. If it changes from 30 to 80, then you would be worried as to why are receivables increasing, right? More on that later, but broadly, you will expect that working capital will change with sales even if it is positive, and ideally, you would want to keep it stable as a percentage of sales. Why? Is because then you can plan the business. You can plan accordingly how much money you have to fund and keep necessary funds at your disposal when business is increasing. If you can plan, you can manage it. If you can't plan, management becomes difficult and tricky. We'll look at more examples of when plans don't work. But ideally, so the pecking order is ideally you want negative and negative by choice, right? Then if not negative, you want stable as percentage of sales. So you want negative working capital, but some businesses don't give that option. If that doesn't happen, then at least as a percentage of your sales value, you should have working capital that is moving around that. If sales increase, inventory, receivables, payables, everything is expected to increase. If sales don't increase, all this is not expected to increase, right? So they should move in line with the sales, and that is what should be the endeavor of managers. We will see in examples that good companies try to manage working capital at a remarkably stable level of sales, regardless of whether it is negative or positive. You can always keep it steady because you can plan the business accordingly, right? So that is what is the endeavor of managers. That's in a nutshell our discussion from this particular section, which is ideally I want negative working capital and I want a stability in working capital as a percentage of sales. Negative may or may not happen depending on my business, but stability is something that is internal, and we should endeavor or try to kind of keep stable working capital in the entire process. If we are able to do that, that is like half the battle won in terms of good financial management of the company, right? So that's it in this particular section.